Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, Jay, just Jay, your resident troublemaker and your resident culture warrior. I hope you are all doing well as we continue through this week of excitement and adventure. I don't know, sounded good. Anyway, I hope you're all doing well. So, all right, as you know, last week was a sort of off week for the channel. Had to go in for a little surgery, but we're beyond that now and getting back into the nitty gritty, if you will, of the day-to-day stuff. So in keeping with that, let's just go right to an article. This one's just a couple hours old, and this one is coming to us from the good folks over at Screen Rant. And this is by Henry Ladd. And this is going to show something that I've sort of been leery might happen. The Rings of Power solution to surviving new Lord of the Rings movies. Amazon's The Rings of Power has a lucky advantage over the upcoming Warner Brothers Lord of the Rings movies that solves the show's competition problem. Okay, and I told you guys that this was like a shot across the bow of Amazon, and they were not going to just take this lying down. Well, it seems that Henry has a solution that could help the Rings of Pewter. Let's see what it is. That The Lord of the Rings of Power, has a potential solution to surviving the new Lord of the Rings movies. Warner Brothers has announced its plans to produce several new movies in the Lord of the Rings universe, sending up alarm flags for Amazon's The Rings of Power. It appears The Rings of Power will now have a competitor in its own universe, making The Rings of Power Season 2 critical to the long-term success of this high budget Amazon Prime original series. Okay, and we all knew that, and that's what I was saying. Okay. The Rings of Power Season 1 received mixed reviews from critics and fans. That's an understatement. But its viewership numbers were extremely high. That is true. Part of the Rings of Power's viewership success, however, is likely due to the fact that Amazon had the only new Lord of the Rings content around. The new Lord of the Rings movies will provide an alternative to Amazon's interpretation of Tolkien's world. Fortunately, The Rings of Power has a built-in solution to differentiate itself from the new Warner Brothers films. Ready for this, folks? The Silmarillion can give Rings of Power an advantage over new Lord of the Rings movies. The Lord of the Rings of Power's built-in advantage over Warner Brothers' new Lord of the Rings movies is that Amazon has a close working relationship with the Tolkien estate, which potentially gives it some access to the Silmarillion. The Rings of Power Season 1 touched upon aspects of the Silmarillion, drawing on some of the famous Legendarium's characters and settings. Warner Brothers' new movies will not be able to touch any of the Silmarillion, meaning the Rings of Power could potentially be able to tell Tolkien stories that its new rival does not have access to. Any Rings of Power Season 2 Silmarillion references will be critical to the show's ability to differentiate from the new Lord of the Rings movies. Whatever aspects of the Silmarillion Amazon is able to use, it must use them to emphasize its loyalty to Tolkien's work and create a story that is distinct from the new movies. The Silmarillion is extremely important to Tolkien's mythology, so Amazon has a chance to be more authentic than the new Warner Brothers movies if it can gain the rights to these aspects of Tolkien's Legendarium. Amazon does not have the rights to the Silmarillion, but has a working relationship with the Tolkien estate. And the Rings of Power heavily alluded to aspects of the Silmarillion in Season 1. The Tolkien estate maintains full rights to the book, but it has demonstrated its willingness to work with Amazon when drawing upon the Tolkien canon for the Rings of Power. While the Rings of Power cannot adapt the Silmarillion directly, therefore, Amazon is in a better position than Warner Brothers to do so. The Tolkien estate does not seem to have any plans to relinquish the rights to the Silmarillion, but this is likely the best-case scenario for the Rings of Power. If the Tolkien estate was to sell the rights to the Silmarillion, a bidding war would likely ensue, and it is possible Amazon would lose out, which would surely kill the Rings of Power. If Amazon can use its Tolkien estate connections to negotiate proper access to the Silmarillion, this would give the Rings of Power material that other Lord of the Rings productions cannot touch. The Rings of Power Season 2 could use the Silmarillion to improve its current stories. Up to this point, the Rings of Power has used many characters and stories featured in the Silmarillion, but has been limited to whatever is mentioned in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The stories in the Rings of Power are currently loosely adapted versions of Tolkien's stories, largely based on the Lord of the Rings appendices. If the Lord of the Rings of Power, is able to gain greater access to the Silmarillion, it will be able to tell more authentic versions of its current stories. Tolkien's characters were created to fit certain storylines, which means adapting those characters without full access to their foundational arcs will inevitably leave them incomplete. That leaves the Rings of Power on Amazon to choose between heavily reshaping characters and stories, or finding a way to gain more access to the Silmarillion, so it can faithfully adapt Tolkien's stories. Considering the divisive storytelling in The Rings of Power Season 1, the latter is a far better option. All right, so there you have it. There is the nightmare fuel that I am delivering to you on this Tuesday. So I mean, let's just, okay. First of all, this just goes back to what I was saying. Okay, a lot of people were like, "Oh, the Warner Brothers announcement means that they're just going to reboot the Lord of the Rings trilogy of movies, right? Redo the Peter Jackson movies." And I'm like, "No, that's not what they're saying at all. They actually specify that they're looking to do new stories, okay, within that universe." So there's that. And anybody who was saying, and I know there were quite a few people out there that were putting out stuff saying that Warner Brothers was announced that it was going to reboot the Lord of the Rings trilogy. That is not the case. That is not the case. They're going to tell new stories. Secondly, I also mentioned that this was a shot across the bow to Amazon, because it meant that Amazon had competition, but competition from people who knew what they were doing, because they had done Lord of the Rings based stuff previously and had been highly successful with it. Okay. So now we see that they're suggesting that the Rings of Power actually try to get access to the Silmarillion, something that Payne and Decay and Jennifer Salke and others had pointed out that they never had access to. Okay, but as the article points out, the show did find ways to sort of make reference to some of this stuff, right? And so now they're like, hey, what we can do in order to differentiate us from the films is to just literally get the Silmarillion, which is, like I said, the nightmare scenario, right? That's like literally having, like, your drunk uncle who you only see it on holidays, right? Your drunk uncle suddenly has the nuclear codes, right? It is not a pleasant scenario to envision, right? So, and they even admit that if a bidding war started for the Silmarillion, Amazon would lose. So what Amazon has to do, Amazon has to use their connections within the Tolkien estate to try to sort of finesse the ability to more directly tell some stories from the Silmarillion. The problem is Amazon's already sort of painted themselves into a corner, because they've drifted away significantly, and you guys know this, from some of the stories in the Silmarillion, i.e., Galadriel and her husband, and Celeborn and their daughter Celebrian, the order in which the rings are created, the whole thing with Anatar, right? The whole thing with sort of Sauron influencing the Numenorians and the whole nine. And they've already drifted so far away from that. It's hard. Like, you would literally almost have to be doing a hard reboot of the series in order to get it to the point where you could more closely align it with the Silmarillion proper, right? They've sort of picked little parts of the Silmarillion that they wanted to tell and tweaked it and tweaked things to fit the story that they want to tell. And so I mean, I don't think Amazon, they may have the inside track for accessing the Silmarillion, in that they have the ability to work with the Tolkien estate. However, I don't think from a storytelling or a writing or show perspective that they can do that at this point, since they've diverged so much from the Silmarillion. To try and go back now and retrofit the current stories and the current storylines to comply with Silmarillion would be almost like you might as well just abandon season one and start over, right? Which I don't think, there's too much money on the table for Amazon to do that. So, having said that, the other thing I think this article forgets to mention is that Warner Brothers also has the access, not just specifically to the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films, but like Amazon, they also have access to adapt Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, the appendices, basically, in Lord of the Rings. So Warner Brothers technically could make some films, and like I've mentioned previously, based on the appendices, on the short little summary descriptions of events in the appendices. Warner Brothers has access to that too. Like I said, a trilogy that's strictly adhering to the story of the fall of Numenor, right? Or a trilogy that is strictly culminates in the War of the Last Alliance, right? Or the Last Alliance. Warner Brothers still has that ability to do that because they also have access to the appendices, which ironically enough is the same stuff that Amazon is using, although Amazon felt like there was enough there to give us a basic framework and then we could sort of fill it in on our own, right? Without needing the Silmarillion. It's interesting that now there's discussion of how much they need the Silmarillion, even though they've already diverged, in my opinion, too far to make it comply with the Silmarillion. But Warner Brothers has the access to the same, appendices, and I think that if they wanted to, they could tell those stories and more closely adhere to what's actually written in the appendices, as opposed to just using them as a framework, right? That's my take on it. So I think, this author, I'm just trying to see who is the author of the article here, Henry Ladd. While he does have some good points, I think he's off the mark on this one a little bit. Yes, it is ultimately, like, I guess, an end around that that Amazon could use, but I don't think they're going to do it because I think they realize there's too much work involved, and it almost demands, if you wanted to adhere closely to the Silmarillion, it almost demands that you reboot the entire series, and forego some of the storylines that they've already put in, because some of the storylines that they've put in directly run counter to what's in the Silmarillion, right? And you guys know this. Okay, the order in which the rings are created. There's entire characters and story arcs and character personalities that are changed in the show that are completely 180 degrees different than what's in the Silmarillion. So I don't think Amazon actually. I don't think that's an option for them. I let me rephrase that. I think it is an option for them, but I think it would be probably the least viable option that they might have at their disposal. I think what's going to happen is right now Amazon, and you're hearing it here, so we'll find out sooner or later whether or not this is correct or not. But I think Amazon is going to stay the course. I think they've already got too much money invested in as even just with season one, right? They're not going to change it up, right? They realize that they've already pissed off the Tolkien fans, and they don't care. Remember, you guys are nothing but, misogynistic, phobic, ists, right? So they don't care about Tolkien fans. They've made that abundantly clear, right? They also have no care for trying to honor the work of Professor Tolkien. Right? They don't care. What they are looking for is something that they can sell to the public, sell to a new modern audience who doesn't know any better, right? That's what they're looking for, and I think that they already have in their eyes they have that with season one, so they're just going to continue to build on that. They're going to double down on that investment. Okay, they're not going to change course at this point, right? That's just my take on it. I think that it will entirely depend on Warner Brothers' timeline for their films, when their films will start coming out, because you got to remember, as much as we may not like it, Rings of Pewter does have a slight advantage in that they've already got season one under their belt and they're already hard at work on season two. Warner Brothers just announced that now they're looking at, they just inked a deal that will allow them to make more Lord of the Rings content, but that doesn't mean that they have anything in development other than the War of the Rohirrim. So they still have to write scripts and ideas and treatments and so on, and then work, start up the whole production process. So we're talking years away at best, right? Which will allow Rings of Pewter to sort of dig in like a bad tick, right? So I think that's what's going to happen. And again, I don't see Amazon changing course. I don't see Amazon overtly using the Silmarillion. Not any. I should say, I don't see them overtly using the Silmarillion anymore in that the way that they have already thus far, i.e., just pulling convenient little aspects and then sort of doing Amazon's take on those aspects, right? Even though they may be factually wrong or maybe, lore or canon incorrect. But that's just my take on it. So, yeah, we'll see. I just thought it was interesting that for all the excuses that these same outlets, Screen Rant, CBR, and others, for all the excuses we were getting about, like, well, they didn't have access to the Silmarillion, so they sort of had to create some of this backstory, and that's why you have to sort of be forgiving, right? Because they don't have access to the Silmarillion, so they have to sort of make some of this second era, second age stuff up to sort of flesh it out and stuff like that. And now that Warner Brothers has announced that they're going to be making Lord of the Rings movies, now you're getting these very same people saying, well, you know what Amazon should do? They should get their hands on the Silmarillion. Yeah, they should have got their hands on the Silmarillion from the outset. Obviously, that wasn't an option for them, so they shouldn't have tried to tell, second age stories, which are largely in the Silmarillion, without having access to the Silmarillion. But, what do I know, right? Anyway, let me know what you folks think down in the comment section below. Like I said, I don't think Amazon is going to change course at this point. I don't see them doing anything other than doubling down on the current storylines and story arcs and their current position in terms of Tolkien and Tolkien fandom and what's going to happen with the series. But let me know what you think down in the comment section below. All right, and I think that's going to do it for this one. Remember, if you like the video, like the video. If you feel like sharing the video, by all means do so. It helps us with the YouTube algorithm, trying to grow the channel, trying to get things moving again. Lost a little steam there because I had had to take a medical break, but now that we're back on track, trying to get the steam building and get the momentum going forward. All right, so yeah, if you feel like sharing it, by all means do so. Spread the word. Spread the word. And if you have not already, I would hope that you would consider subscribing to the channel. We try to keep it fun. We try to keep it light, but we also try to keep it real up in this bitch. So, yeah. So if you haven't subscribed, I would hope that you would consider subscribing and joining the army of beautiful badasses. If you have subscribed, as always, thank you from the bottom of my heart. You guys and gals are the best, and I love the interaction and seeing the conversations that happen down in the comment section below. So I'm looking forward to seeing what your take on this one is, right? Like I said, for me, it's the nightmare scenario. Amazon getting full access to the Silmarillion. Oof. Ooh, that just sends a shiver down my spine. But yeah, remember, we do have a merch store now. It's not big. I'm still working it. Still working on it. But if you want to proudly show your support for the Army of Beautiful Badasses, there's some shirts and other items that you can get now that have our logo and our designs on it and stuff like that. We also have a Discord channel where we have some good discussions over there. Covering not just Tolkien stuff, but Tolkien stuff, channel-related stuff, art stuff, writing stuff, fantasy stuff, Dungeons & Dragons stuff, Dragonlance stuff, all sorts of stuffs, right? So check out Discord as well. I'll put the links to the Discord and the merch store in the little thing down below. And I think that's going to do it for now. So until the next time, remember to be good, be safe, be awesome, but more importantly, stay more darkish. Peace.